Guten Tag. This is episode 4, 2026. We're talking about Azure Service Bus, and this is subscribe. Thank you for tuning in into this set of introductory short talks about products that we're working on. And today it's Azure Service Bus. Quick overview, 10 minutes over what we have in that product. Azure Service Bus is a message queue and PubSub broker. So it's worth to talk about queues for a moment. A message queue is one of the most fundamental, most important infrastructure pieces in distributed systems. A queue accepts and stores messages and then makes them available. And what makes it different from something like Kafka is that it actually does individual state management for the lifecycle of each message. So the message becomes available for consumption. Then you can acquire it. That means it's locked, and then you can go and work on it. And if you're done with it, you accept it. And then it goes into an archive and deleted state. You can also reject it, in which case it goes into something like a dead letter queue. Messages are exclusively acquired by one consumer, which means it helps you to guarantee that only one consumer, only one party works on a job at a time. And then you can go and look at the length of the queue, and that will give you a hint for whether you need to go and scale resources up to go and do more work, because there's more stuff to do. So this is the same as in the supermarket. If there's a long line and they open another cashier's desk, they look at the length of the queue. So this is a very intuitive way of driving scaling. Of course, this entire lifecycle business is about reliable processing. So the queue brokers are the reliability backbone of an application. And really this exclusive assignment is the most important feature that a queue broker has. Several patterns are realized with this. There's competing consumers, so there's multiple parties which are trying to get work done, and this exclusive assignment guarantees that amongst competing consumers, only one gets that job. And then it helps with load leveling. You have a lot of traffic coming from the front. There's a rush, and the business process at the end cannot be rushed, should not be put under stress. So this indirection of pushing from the front and pulling from the back, where the business process only gets as much work as it really can deal with, that creates robustness in systems, and that's why it's effectively reliability as a service. So Service Bus is a queue and PubSub message broker, fully managed. You don't deal with VMs, you don't think about VMs, you only think about capacity that you need, and then we go and allocate that for you. Memory is not an objective, but it's really only like throughput and latency is what you think about. It's AMQP 1 standards compliant, which means that every AMQP client can talk to it. All of our SDKs for it are based on the AMQP protocol, and it's also through a provider fully JMS conformant, which means if you have applications in Java that use JMS, those can usually be ported very easily to Service Bus. The SDKs are available for numerous languages. Service Bus is one of the oldest and most important services in Azure. So there's more SDK coverage for Azure Service Bus than many other services, and it has industry-leading reliability and availability. There's effectively two SKUs. One is Service Bus Standard. That's shared infrastructure, shared resources. You might have a noisy neighbor problem at times. And if you don't want to have that, you go and create your isolated resources model, which is Service Bus Premium. And Service Bus Premium, because you have your isolated resources, because you have your own CPU, because you have your own memory, we can also do more work. Therefore, Premium also has more features. So GMS 2, which has a bunch of sophisticated things, is only available in Service Bus Premium. Service Bus Standard has JMS 1.1 support. Also the throughput quotas are a bit different between standard and premium. Typically, production workloads you want to generally run on Service Bus Premium. This is not an arbitrary distinction where we go and take more money here, more money there. There's completely two different architectures. In another show, I'm going to talk about those. And they simply have a compatible SDK, but otherwise, those are completely different services. We allocate for you virtual brokers, similar to what I said last episode about event hubs. So you get, effectively, we allocate for you a DNS name. Behind that DNS name is a networking configuration. And then you get your own virtualized space where you have your queues and your topics and all these things organized. And then we map that down onto that infrastructure. As said, very similar view between standard and premium, even though different architectures, and you go and manage that through the Azure Resource Manager. Generally, Service Bus queues is a log. You go and append to that log as you're writing messages, as you're sending to them. We make sure that if you send a message, before we acknowledge that message back, you will get, we will go and write that message to at least 3 copies, 3 replicas across zones. And if you are using the geo-replication feature that we have, similar to what we have in Event Hubs, then we will write the message to the primary region, we write the message to the secondary region, and only if we have acknowledgements from both, we will go and acknowledge that back to you. If you want in synchronous replication, if you have asynchronous replication, then we write to the primary and then we replicate later. The way how a queue works is very simple. The oldest available message is the next that is acquired and delivered. There is a way with JMS to have message selectors of sorts. So you can actually go and you can spearfish into a queue and you can get the first available messages. Another feature that we're not going to discuss in detail is called sessions here, which allows you to create effectively virtual queues on top of queues that don't have header line blocking. And there can be up to 5,000 concurrent consumers on a queue. And a consumer goes into the queue, gets a message, and that message is then exclusively assigned. Only that party has it. And then it can go and do the work on it. There's a lock that expires that you can go and renew. And if you fail to renew, if the process is dying, then that message goes back into the pool and can be processed again. But we count the number of these deliveries, and then if that exceeds a certain threshold, then we put that into a dead letter queue, and the dead letter queue is something that's associated with each queue. So the consumer tells the broker what it wants the broker to do with that message. If it's happy, if it has processed the message, it's going to say accept, and then the broker is going to clean that up and remove it. So it's a fairly simple model. Send data in, go data out with state management. Service Bus topics are a distribution mechanism that kind of sits on top of the queues, if you will. So you send data to a topic, that's an address, and then you can go and bind queues onto this with subscriptions. And those subscriptions have filters. The default filter is a true filter, so everything goes through into that subscription. And you can have multiple of these subscriptions in parallel, and each of them gets a copy, so you can go and fan out to different parties. The subscriptions can have selector statements, message selector statements in JMS, so they are in the JMS parlance. If you use our regular SDKs, they're a dialect of SQL 92 with our own syntax. So depends kind of on the API that you come through. And these are effectively where conditions expressed in SQL that you run against the incoming message properties, and then we go and select that message. And then you can also execute actions. So if a message has been selected based on a rule, a filter rule, you can also go and manipulate the properties as you are moving through. And then for the topics, however many copies, however many subscriptions you want, the handling of the messages is exactly the same as in the queues. JMS2, as said, all the features that exist in JMS2 have been realized in Service Bus. It's the only hyperscale broker that is fully conformant with JMS2. And then, of course, we have the native SDKs, the Azure SDKs for all kinds of languages. Sending a message, super easy. You go and you have a connection string that sets up where the service bus is. You can pass credentials in form of shared access control, shared access signatures if you want to, but it's recommended that you simply let the underlying security mechanisms do their work and acquire an Azure token, and then use the built-in RBAC capabilities in the Service Bus client to then have a secure conversation with Service Bus using those credentials. And then you create a queue sender, and then you formulate a message and you send it. That's it. So super simple. This Python example, a few lines, and that's how you interact with Service Bus. Networking features, we give you a networking infrastructure that's either public, you have a public endpoint with firewalling on top of it if you want to, or you get a private endpoint that goes through a private IPv6 endpoint that we have. You can go and bind your virtual networks in Azure against that private endpoint and then talk to your infrastructure. So we create isolation inside the system. This is why this is on premium. You get an isolated CPU, isolated memory, and you kind of got an isolated network chute that sits on top of it, which means you get an isolated pillar, even though all of that runs inside of shared infrastructure. The nice thing about those networking features is that we can bind to multiple VNets at the same time and the public network. So this is a Service Bus is also very good and super secure layer 7 application router. It can see all networks, but those networks are not connected amongst each other, which means you can go and pass messages across the boundaries of networks without the networks actually touching. And that was a very brief overview over Service Bus. There will be more, but for now, thank you for tuning in. Thank you.